Hey, friends, welcome to the Connected Mom podcast, where we really like to have real conversations, helping you to connect more deeply with God, more empathically with your fellow moms, and more intentionally with your child. I am Becky Harling, your host, and we are going to have an amazing conversation today. So, I kind of have a feeling that you might want to have a notebook nearby or a pad where you can write down some things. Our guest today is David Tucker, and he is an author, speaker, husband, father of three teenagers, which, gives him credibility right away, living in Tennessee. But he's had experience as a pastor and a technology executive. And you know, every mom I know out there is asking how much digital media, how much screen time, what should we do with our kids? Technology isn't going away anytime soon. And David is going to provide some answers for us today. He founded digitalparenting.com, and his newest book is the Digital Parenting Guidebook. And let me tell you, after just a brief read on my part, you're going to want to get this book. So, welcome, David.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Yeah, I am too. And so, okay, you're a dad of three teenagers. So, girls or boys?
So we started off with twins that are both boys. And then 17 months later, I had a daughter. So we've got three kids that, in some ways act a little bit more like triplets because they're all so close in age. They all love hanging around each other. But yeah, they're all dramatically different. They have their own personalities and so their own challenges. So just like I'm sure you've talked about many times, parenting, it's just learning about how to tackle kind of one new challenge after another.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the biggest challenges at this particular moment in history is the digital challenge, right? I mean, I confess here publicly, when Steve and I were raising our kids before computers and all of that, my husband was a pastor. The way I survived Sunday morning, I would sit all four kids in front of the TV while I got dressed and said, "Don't change the channel and don't move." And since that time, there's so many more opportunities for screen time, and parents are confused. Is it good? Is it bad? How much? How little? When? So help us a little bit with that. As you've talked about this, you've met all different kinds of parents, and you kind of categorize them into three types. What are those three types?
So when we think about the three types of parents that I encounter at our live events or parents that come up to me when we're talking about the book, we have some parents that just automatically assume that this is a problem for other families, that they've kind of figured things out. Their kids are really good at managing this themselves. They don't really need to worry about it, right? And so we have that type of family. We have another type of family, and this one always hurts when I encounter them, is they just believe that what's happened has already happened. My kids are the way they are. I can't change anything. They're just so involved in the digital world. Maybe if I'd made decisions sooner, but it just kind of is what it is. So that's kind of type 2. I'm always excited at my events when I encounter type 3. And these are the parents that come up to me and they say, "Listen, we don't fully agree with everything you're saying just yet, but there's enough there that we feel like we need to look at this as a family." And kind of the secret behind digitalparenting.com is, we believe ultimately this is just a type of discipleship. This is targeted discipleship at what is happening in our culture. And so if I can find parents in that third group that are willing to just push into this a bit, honestly pray about it, really dive in and see if this is an area they need to tackle in their homes, that's something we can work with. So I'm always excited to run into those families. And I encourage everybody, be one of those families.
Well, and what I love about your book, David, is you talk about as a family talking about this, right? And so it's not like you as a parent coming in saying, "That's it, we're getting rid of all computers, all TVs, all cell phones. We're just going to hibernate in our little home and raise good, quiet, non-involved Christian kids." And so talk to us a little bit about that family plan you talk about.
100%. So first of all, let me just kind of start off by saying, one of the things we realized today, and this is behind everything we do at digitalparenting.com, is even if you as a family tried to totally remove yourself from technology, whether it is in your neighborhood, at church, somewhere, your kids are going to come in contact with another kid who has unrestricted access to the internet. So we have to teach them to make the right decisions and not just push them away from all technology. That's one of the things that we believe firmly. So one of the ways we do that is we walk them through what's called the 7 essential steps of digital parenting. And at each of those steps, there's a little planning effort that the parents put in. And one of the interesting things is the first step, where we talk about regulating screen time, is actually where the parents just look at themselves before we even talk about the kids, because I think we all realize there's areas in our life that we can optimize there too. And then, yes, you have a chance to look at your kids, look at some of the data we've collected. We give recommendations on screen time, but ultimately it's up to every family. But we give you not only guidelines on how to implement it in your home, but we also give you Bible studies and discussion guides so you can sit down with your kids and actually explain why you're doing what.
Okay, let's go back to what you just said, to having parents analyze how much time they're spending on screens. And I love moms, I love dads, I love them all. However, one thing that I have heard from some of the moms who confide in me is, what do I do? Because I want to limit screen time, but my husband is a gamer. When he gets home from work, he wants to game, he's scrolling his cell phone. That's how he veggies out. And the more I talk about it, the more he hibernates into that game time. So what does a mom do in that context?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, kind of going back to what I said earlier, we believe this is a type of discipleship. So just like if we were having other types of issues in our home that we would need to have some in-depth conversations about it, we believe this fits into that same category. Listen, God's given each of us a limited amount of time. And so if we see that anybody, whether it's, myself, my wife needs to come talk to me, or vice versa, that we're maybe not taking advantage of the time God's given us, we're spending a lot of time doing things that don't add a ton of value to our home or to the kingdom of God, it's worth a conversation. But one of the things that we've all, just to be honest, in our culture, we've become really bad at having those kinds of conversations. And so that's part of the reason why when you go through step 1 in the 7 essential steps of digital parenting that are covered in the Digital Parenting Guidebook, like I said, there's a part of that plan that's for families. So you would actually have, if the husband and wife are going through this together, they both would kind of come up with their own answers for this. And there's a part where they come together and talk about their answers. We try to give them a platform with some targeted questions to be able to have this conversation if it's something that maybe they haven't done, or they've let this go for a long time, even though it's been something that's been building up. And so that's really one of our goals here, whether it's parent to parent or parent to child, we're trying to have more honest conversations about where we're.
Yeah, I love that. And, I would just say to those of you that are moms that are listening, to dare to have those conversations, with your spouse. And if you're having problems having those conversations, bring in an outside expert just to help you navigate what a conversation looks like. And also invite your kids at some point into that conversation, because they're seeing things that maybe you're not seeing, and so we lead by example, right? So what's one of the most common questions you've been asked, David, as you've been teaching this?
It's so funny, and it's probably easy to predict, but literally this is 100 times as much as I get any other question. It's going to be parents asking, when should I get my kid a phone, right? This is the number one question by far. And in reality, if you think about it, this is now kind of this coming of age thing. Every parent is going to have to figure out how to answer this question. And it's not an easy question to be able to answer. And what I tell parents is, listen, if that's the question that you're asking the wrong question. Let's talk about, I say, here's 3 questions to ask in place of that. First is, have I trained my child, really discipled my child on how to handle the temptations that will come through having a phone? Okay, that's question 1. Question 2, has my child demonstrated that they're ready to take on the responsibility that comes with having a phone, right? They're going to be carrying something around that might be, $800 in their pocket. Has your child demonstrated that they can do that, right? And then the third question is, do I, as a parent, have the time to properly configure the phone and train my child to use it in an appropriate way? And if you can't answer yes to all three of those questions, it's not time, and it doesn't matter what age your child is, right? Now, there are situations that are complicated. I acknowledge that. There's a lot of co-parenting situations that I've talked parents through where this is a very complicated question. And one of the ways we can kind of shortcut this is maybe you can give your kid a device that can allow you to communicate with them, but yet isn't a full-featured smartphone, if you can't fully answer yes to some of those other questions. So those are just things to think about. I hope that those questions, parents can take those back and really analyze the situation and determine if they're really doing a good thing by giving their kid a phone, or maybe they're actually doing a really harmful thing by giving their kid a phone.
Yeah, and I like that because you do really, it takes work to give your child a phone. It's not like you just send them into a T-Mobile store or Verizon, they set it up, your kid walks off. And I know in this day and age, because there's a lot of fear, particularly I find with moms sending their kids to school because of all the school shootings. I know some of my family members whose kids have not been ready for a phone yet. They've gotten them a watch where they can track their kids, and their kids can text if there's a problem in school with their parents and maybe with my husband and I, who are their grandparents, but it's not like a full range phone yet. And I think that those are wise steps. Interesting. I just heard on the news the other day. I hope this doesn't throw you, David, but I heard that New York public schools are actually considering banning all cell phones in the school because it's become so addictive for the kids and the kids can't process. What do you think about that?
Dr. Jonathan Haidt came out with a book recently called The Anxious Generation, and he goes through, and so we there's a lot of pieces that are in that book, but one of the things that he talks about is really the future for creating learners that are able to focus in and dive more deeply into material, and we'll talk about why that's important in just a second, but the future for that is no devices in schools, and he laid this out very clearly, and he's obviously a well-known author, so he was going around basically sharing this message on all the major news networks, and that's really led to a lot of this catching on. It was kind of a movement before as well. But one of the things that, we now see, if we look back, even at screen time at younger ages, we're seeing kids having their ability to focus actually be compromised through using devices. And so now if we take and we put these devices into the school system, which they are now, we're noticing that kids are having trouble. And we're actually seeing things like test scores that have always stayed relatively the same with standardized tests actually going down in some cases. And I think this is just an acknowledgement of where we're at. This is something we're going to have to do. And the other piece to this that I would add in, I did an interview, and this was back in 2019 with a few school resource officers, so the police officers that are in schools here in this area. And they told me that over half of their job, all the way back in 2019, is dealing with things that happen at school that started on phones. So issues whether it's bullying, whether it's sending inappropriate images, it's a giant distraction for the school day. So I think it's going to be an increasing movement where we're going to see more and more states at least exploring this idea.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. It's kind of shocking in some ways, because you have parents like, oh, I want my kid to have a phone in school because I don't know what's going to happen during their school day, and I always want them to be able to reach me. But how do you keep them off the phone during the classroom time, And it is just a major distraction. I read a statistic recently for a book I was writing, and it said that the average adult now has this same attention span as a goldfish. I don't know if that's true, but that's pretty staggering, And okay, so let's talk about this mental health crisis that we're in and the correlation between that and the digital technology that we're all in. I mean, right? It's leading to less face to face time, less true connections. You would think we would be more connected than ever, right? But we're not. So, talk to us about that.
This is something that when you look at the data, it's almost unbelievable. right? And so we talk about this one statistic at my live events. I always bring this up, that when we look at 10 to 20% jumps in behavior over a few years would startle any of us. But yet what we've seen, and let's just take one group. So if we look at girls aged 10 to 14, so there was a period of time between around 2010 to 2018, and we saw the number of them that actually were admitted to the hospital for the first time for harming themselves went up by 189%, right? And so when we look at that, we have to say, well, what happened? What happened? Because 2009 to 2010 is this inflection point that we see where all the data changes, especially for girls, even more so than boys. Although it's getting worse for boys. But this number, when we look at things like major depressive episodes, when we look at self-harm, when we look at suicide, all those things start to change around 2010. And that was the point at which really smartphones had come into the mainstream, and pretty much everyone in middle school and high school had them in their pockets, or were starting to get there. We had a critical mass. And so we've seen things continue to get worse. And so there's research from like Dr. Gene Twinney out of San Diego State and others that have written a lot of books about this. And what we can see is social media is likely the leading factor here. Now, again, it's always hard to truly prove all of those things, but we even know, based off of some of the internal data that leaked from Facebook, that social media companies know it's harming especially girls, especially their self-image. And so one of the things that we guide parents through in step 3 of the 7 essential steps of digital parenting is learning how to safeguard the mental health of your child. And one thing that's been proven is the less time your child spends on social media, the happier they will be with their life and with themselves.
Yeah, it was interesting. Several months ago, I heard an interview with Nona Jones, who actually works for Facebook, is a believer, and she hasn't allowed her kids to get on social media, and even though she works for the company. And I thought that was really interesting. But, it's so addictive, and it's so comparison led, and for some of these girls that are teenagers, they're comparing themselves to an image that's been filtered or enhanced or whatever. And the end result is depression. And it's also, it seems to me, an opportunity for bullying. I've heard stories from parents where social media has been used to bully other kids in the school. And so what is your recommendation for parents with social media? When are kids ready for that, or should they just not have it until they're adults? I don't know.
It's a great question. So what we guide parents through is really helping them understand each of the different platforms. So one of the things we know is not all social media is equal, right? There's some platforms that are more dangerous than others. And so when we talk about, girls, for example, we know that Instagram plays a huge role in some of the issues we see now with depression and anxiety and bullying even. But we also can see that, there's not the same risk, on other platforms, but yet each platform has its own unique risk. And so we want parents to understand that, and that they need to have open communication with their kid about, listen, we think that this age is when we'll start talking about this. We're not going to talk about it beforehand. One of the things I think that's so critical, and this has even come out from the Surgeon General of the United States, I think parents should seriously think twice about their kids being on any social media before 16. And part of the reason for that is because our brains are not quite yet developed enough to handle some of the types of feedback that we'll get from the internet, from the unfiltered internet, when we're below that age. And even if maybe your kid's a little bit further ahead than others, one of the other things that happens is when one kid in a friend group gets social media, it becomes this viral thing where everyone has to have social media. And so parents can actually do not only their kid, but also other kids in their friend group a favor by saying, listen, we're going to hold off on this. But we also want to guide parents through a discussion they're going to have with their kids about social media. They need to be able to understand if they're scrolling and all of a sudden they start to feel bad about their life, right? Once they do get on social media, let's talk about biblical ways that we can handle that, and also be able to recognize that so we can push back instead of pushing into social media when that happens.
So wise. I love that, David. And I actually loved that Surgeon General's report, because it even talked about adults on social media, and the more time you spend on social media, the less connected you actually are in your friendships, and that, so it's going to have a staggering impact on our culture and on our kids just being able to be social and have regular people skills, right?
Yeah. What we know when we look at the data, our kids are happier with a smaller amount of quality friendships where they have face-to-face time than they're going to be with thousands of people that they have shallow connections to online. And that's what we need to, as parents, we need to learn how to funnel our child's time to build those kind of relationships that are going to ultimately be encouraging for them. They're going to help them grow the skills that they need to, again, operate face-to-face in our world. And again, it's not that they can't have social media at some point. It's not that they can't have friends on social media, but we need to draw a distinction between what's ultimately valuable in the amount of time we spend there versus what is, maybe doesn't have nearly as much long term.
So, okay, let's talk about teens. They get invited to their friends' houses, and we don't want to be too controlling as parents, yet we want to give guidance. So your teen perhaps is at a friend's house where parents don't have the same restraints, and all of a sudden they're exposed to something you don't want them to be exposed to. What does a parent do, and how do we prepare our kids for that moment? I think that's the more important question. How do we prepare them?
This is such a great question. And one of the things it really pushes here is that we need to have these conversations early, because this is a lot easier if your kid knows what to look out for than if they have to try to figure that out for themselves on the spot. So that's one of the reasons why, we have discussion guides for things like pornography. So this is just one example. And even, and we've talked to so many parents, they're having this conversation too late. And what I'm about to say, I know is going to seem painful. We need to be having this conversation once our kids reach about 7. Okay, because they need to know, hey, if there's something that I see that fits into this category, here's the steps I need to take. I need to immediately leave the situation, immediately go talk to mom and dad, or ask the parent there, hey, I need to call my mom and dad. And so if you don't give them those instructions ahead of time so that they know what to do in that moment, again, they're just left to try to figure it out. And often, in addition to that, it's not even just, hey, my kid was exposed to this. If your kid has any communication channel that's open to people in the outside world, you also need to talk to them about what happens if somebody sends you something that's inappropriate and it ends up. And unfortunately, these days, just if we look at the news, we need to explain to them that this is true, even if that's your teacher or, your youth minister or anyone in your life. Here's the steps you need to take if this happens. Now, if you're a parent and you're saying, oh, that conversation sounds way too hard, I'll just throw out a couple things. We do have a discussion guide that's included if you get the book. It's a free resource that's included with the book. But there's also great books out there. So Kristen Jensen has Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, and there's a junior version of that. So you don't have to go in depth about what pornography is to give your child the tools they need to know when they need to come and get you, if that's something that's happening.
Yeah, and I think that parents are at times a little bit naive. They don't want to have that difficult conversation. I can almost guarantee your kids are hearing that kind of stuff in school. Even if you have your child in a Christian school or a charter school, they're going to come in contact with somebody that knows about that. And so it's better that you take the initiative and open the conversation early. So I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I think 7 is a great time to start having these conversations so that your child is prepared, because we want to raise wise kids. We don't want to raise kids that are so naive they're blown out of the water when they are exposed to something like this. So, we've talked a lot about technologies, and we definitely see the evil in it, but you know because God has, in some ways, he's given us the gift of technology. And so how do we help our kids understand the blessing of it while being wise with the bad side of it?
Yeah, 100%. So one of the things I talk about in the book, and I also will talk about this at most of my live events, is the same tools that were used to build the tabernacle were the same tools that were used to build the golden calf, right? And so when we talk about technology, technology is a tool. We can use it to do great things. I keep in contact with a lot of missionaries every single week that are out on the field across the world. And I do that through, Facebook Messenger and through Zoom and other things. This is amazing that we can actually stay this connected on the other side of the world. And we've also done teachings and other things to groups that are on the other side of the world. And so that's a blessing. That's something we should celebrate. And Tony Rinke says in his book, Christians and Technology, if we can thank God for it, then we should bring it, it should be fine to bring into our lives. And there's a lot of areas of technology that are very helpful. Being a software developer, my kids have somewhat of an interest in that. I've been able to guide them to some great online resources where they can learn some of those skills. I've been able to work with them on that. My kids have also been able to use online tools for learning how to deal with money and many, many other things. So I don't ever want to tell parents, hey, just totally push completely away from technology. There are great resources out there, but I also, again, want to caution parents and remind them that we can very much become like kind of that story in the Bible where it talks about when our kids ask for a fish and we give them a snake. If we're just giving them technology because we think that's going to help them, but we haven't put common sense boundaries in place and we haven't had discussions with our kids, we're not doing them the favor that we think that we're doing.
Yeah, and I love the way you keep bringing it back to discussions with your kids, have the conversation with them. I hope you're picking up on that, moms, because those conversations are critical for your kids, because they are going to be exposed to this. And technology is a gift. You were talking about missionaries, and I think of, missionaries that we know that we have served, and, they're overseas, and some of them, because of where they're living, their kids are doing online schooling, right? So technology is there. That's a gift. But again, it's got to be, there have to be those limits, and we've got to teach our kids wisdom. If there was one piece of advice that you could give to moms who are maybe after listening to this in a total panic, like, oh my gosh, we haven't had the conversation yet and we've blown it. And what do we do? And maybe my husband's not going to be on the same page. What's the advice you give them?
Yeah. The first thing I would say is take comfort in the fact that it was God who called you to be a parent in 2024. Right. And so God is able to provide what you need to be able to start working on this in your home. And so I would just say use this as an opportunity to pray about it and then take one step. Just start working in that direction. Even if that's, whether it's doing something like picking up the book, that's great. But even if you don't want to do that, there's a lot of great free resources that are available that can help you shape just something maybe as simple as just screen time in the beginning, right? Take that first step, because the moment you've implemented that, you're actually helping with all the other dangers that are out there. Then once you get that in place, take another step. Don't feel like you have to tackle this entire issue in one weekend and you've got to be perfect at it and never make a mistake for the rest of the time your kids are at home, right? That's just not the way it works. So I would just encourage you, just start taking steps in the right direction, but understand that it's a spiritual issue as well. So take time to pray about it, take time to read God's word, let him really just guide you in terms of the specific areas you might need to focus on, because some of the moms listening probably have some concerns about a specific issue with their child. And so if that's your case, if the case as well, don't hesitate on, even bringing this up at your next visit with the pediatrician. They're really diving into this area more because this is now tied in a lot to your kid's health. Also, don't be afraid if you have serious concerns to find a mental health professional to talk with some of these issues about, because one of the worst things we can do is simply take our concerns and sweep them under the rug and just say, you know what, we think it's going to be okay.
Mm-hmm. I love that so much, David. Hey, you were a pastor. Are you still a pastor?
So I'm actually on the preaching team at our church. I'm just a volunteer member of that. And I also teach 8th grade boys on Sunday morning. So
God bless you. Okay. So, hey, to close us out, I just want to ask you, would you pray over our moms? Because this is a huge issue, and I think they need encouragement.
Absolutely. So, dear God, I'm so thankful for all the listeners, all the moms that are listening into this podcast. Again, you have given us each a calling to be a parent in 2024. And for some people, that might be their biological kids. For others, it might be grandparents that are playing a significant role in parenting their grandchildren or fostering, adopting, whatever the case is. And I just pray that you would be with all of them. And I pray that you would help guide them in areas that they need to work on here. But I also pray that you would just give them peace day to day, knowing that you're working here and that you will bless the efforts that they put into this area. Help them not to feel so overwhelmed that they just choose to do nothing, but help them to take steps in the right direction so they can disciple their kids to deal with the challenges that are just going to be inevitable here in our digital age in 2024. We thank you for working in each of our families. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Hey, friends, thanks for joining us today on The Connected Mom. And I hope actually that you're going to share this episode with your friends. I think it would be a great episode to listen with a group of your friends and then talk about it afterwards. And join us again next week for another episode of The Connected Mom. Thanks for joining us today.